What's up, guys? Happy Tuesday. Welcome back to another episode of Eat, Train, Prosper. Today, Brian and myself are joined by Kassem Hanson. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, back in, I want to say, late November, we had Kassem on the podcast for the first time. Today, we are going to be talking around interpreting muscle length research. If you are unfamiliar with Kassem, I would implore you to go explore his Instagram, the Instagrams of N1 Education and N1 Training, which are the, education and training arms of N1 that Kassem is the founder of. Just incredibly impactful information around training, things that Brian and myself have gone deep down the rabbit hole, has really kind of revolutionized how we've approached and looked at and understood training. So a lot of really cool and quality information from Cass that I know I am very fortunate to have, I would say stumbled upon, but Brian put me onto it. I did not stumble upon it. So like I said, we're going to be talking around interpreting the muscle length research, which is something that we've talked about on the show before. Before we jump into all of that, we're going to start, Brian, with some updates, please.
Yeah. I think our listeners should probably be pretty familiar with Cass and N1 since we pretty much talk about them on every single episode that we do. So it's great to have you back, Cass. And quick updates on me. I'm now at exactly the 4-week point since tearing my plantar fascia on the day of the photo shoot. And I'm beginning to walk normal. I still can't quite go heel ball toe, so there's still a little bit of compensation. My left leg is still bumming as a result of compensating for the right. I just can't seem to get away from doing 10 or 12,000 steps a day, just chasing these little kids around. And so that sucks. I feel like I should be more healed now than I am, but it is progressing along. I've been biking a lot, which I talked about on the last episode, and I will continue to talk about here as we go forward. And training is into week 4 now for my new meso, progressing things into partials and then eventually some reverse drop sets, which accentuates the length and position, which is very specific to today's episode. So all stuff that I'll expand on next week when we have a bit more time to go through updates. And I'll just kick it on over to Cass for what's been going on with him here.
I'm on that fun trip that you get when you take a couple weeks off training and then you come back and you get all the fresh DOMs again. So I'm on the second half of that. But it's really interesting how the stuff that we talk about today is actually going to be like things that I utilize. Like first week back, I cut back a little bit on some lengthened stuff and a little bit more shortened stuff, and then second time through each muscle group, then I progress the volume and the lengthened stuff or whatever. So I would say compared to what I would have done, a decade ago, even though it's like, I'm significantly older, coming back was not too bad, right? And I was actually doing like nothing but basically waking up, hiking, eating, go to bed for like 2 weeks straight. I was like, I have no idea what my strength and stuff is going to be like coming back in, right? And my initial strength was absolutely tanked, but I'd say I recovered maybe 80% of it within the first session, right? So, it's always nice when you're like, yeah, you don't really lose it. Like you don't lose it for real. It's just like, okay, there's just going to be a small, resensitization or, reacclimation period. So that's where I am.
For me, I am officially back on the hypertrophy train. I had 2 different cycles. One was metabolic, the previous one was neuro, and now I am finally into my second week of another hypertrophy phase, which I am really enjoying, except for like the anxiety of top sets of hack squat sort of thing, which I went through today, but was happy to progress. I took a little trip. It was my girlfriend's birthday. Yesterday we went out into like the middle of Bali. So we got out of the bubble of like the western hotspots. We went up into the mountains, which had these little like microclimates, and it was like really cool to get out in like the middle of nowhere, just in like the mountain jungle, which was really cool. Intuitively ate for a couple days, which, we kind of previously talked about before we started recording, and things went really well. I had actually identical weights on the day that I left and then the day that I came back, which is more coincidence than, my capabilities of estimating things, but just goes to show that like you can really, if you want to, and if that is your priority for a trip, keep things pretty tight with the travel. So that was a lot of fun, and didn't have any negative digestive aversions with the food eating out, which is always a massive win in my book. Other than that, no big updates for me. Just excited to be back, into hypertrophy, and excited to get into this conversation. Brian, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, for sure. So, overall, the conversation, as Aaron said, is basically going to be about the current state of research and the way that we look at training at short muscle lengths and long muscle lengths, and maybe some discussion around whether movements are overloaded short or overloaded lengthened. Most of our listeners should probably be pretty familiar with these terms, but I want to kick it over to Cass and just kind of get his definite or working definitions for today on short and long muscle lengths, and then the overload at each specific position.
Yeah, so with short and long muscle lengths, I mean, it literally is like just imagining like if you were to take the muscle out and, stretch it or let it contract. And so if we're working in an exercise where, the joints are going to a way where that muscle is getting as short as possible, that's what we're talking about for short. If we're looking at exercises where it's getting as much of a stretch as possible, those would be our lengthened exercise. So it is the actual what percentage of the muscle's length or where within its total length are we working? Whereas overload is where within the range of motion of an exercise something is hard. So a good example of that is, if you were to do incline dumbbell curls where you're like using some shoulder extension, that shoulder extension is basically lengthening the biceps a little bit more. So we're going to a longer muscle length. But because the dumbbell is just using gravity, like the bottom position actually isn't hard. So you're not overloading that stretch position. You just happen to be going to more of a length, but it's still, going to be the mid to short position of that exercise that is actually the most challenging. But if you were to say, do that same position, but have a cable that was pulling behind you, now that exercise would both be in the lengthened position while also making that the hardest part of the exercise. And there's application to both of these things, but a lot of times, probably I would say 75, 80% of the time when you're using these things, you're going to try and use them in conjunction a little bit. Like if you're going to do a short position exercise, you're probably going to also make the resistance hard in that position to make it worth actually going there. And same thing, for the lengthened is you want to make sure that there's enough resistance that it was actually worth going to that stretch. So even though these are technically different things, one is length and one is, the resistance, challenge of where it's hard, we tend to overlap them a lot, when we're applying them to training.
I think one example that might make sense to the listener too is looking at a seated leg curl, which trains the hamstrings at a long muscle length. But where the overload is, like where that movement is hardest, can depend on the machine, or you can, potentially be able to adjust that based on the machine that you might have access to, like a Prime machine or the one that I have at home. So that resistance curve could be, you're training at long muscle lengths, but it's hardest in the short position, and maybe there's almost no tension when you're at the long muscle length. And then alternatively, it could be the complete opposite, where there's tons of tension at that stretch position, and then it gets easier as the muscle gets shorter and you begin curling. So that would kind of be one way that I think about it makes sense for the listener. Straker, any thoughts there?
Nope, you guys cover that really straightforward and simple. Sweet. For people to understand.
Cass, what are biarticular muscles?
So biarticular muscles are muscles that cross more than one joint. And this is really easy when you look at things like the biceps or the hamstring, where it's like, okay, they cross the elbow and then they cross the shoulder if we're talking about biceps. They cross the knee and the hip if we're talking about, the hamstrings. It gets a little bit more complicated when we're talking about muscles, say like, the lats, for instance. It's like, well, they cross the shoulder joint, but does the rib cage also count as a joint in there that they cross too, right? And what about the scapula? Is that, kind of a separate thing? So really, I would say it's like you have muscles that clearly only impact one joint, and then you have muscles that impact multiple joints. And so there's a difference in complexity for the nervous system when using those things. And there's also, for the topic today of talking about, muscle lengths, is if you can affect a muscle's length with more than one joint, that means you usually have an opportunity to change its length more, meaning that, compared to the brachialis that just crosses the elbow joint, you can change the relative length of the biceps more because you can move both the elbow and the shoulder to change those length, right? And so when we're looking at application of that, that means that, you just have to do elbow flexion, elbow extension to fully lengthen and fully shorten the brachialis. But for the biceps, you might have to do two exercises, one with a shorter shoulder position and one with a more lengthened position for the shoulder, to be able to challenge the biceps through the full range of motion that you have available.
Yep. Cool. And so does it change that some muscles that are biarticular or not have different, are affected differently by stretch mediated hypertrophy? Like they may respond differently to that?
Yeah, well, one of the big aspects of that is just going to be like the amount of the like anatomical sarcomere length that you use with those. So it's not a clear thing of it's just like biarticular or multi-articular muscles always can get more of a stretch. But I would say in general, those have a greater, like you use a greater portion of that like total sarcomere length. So if you're thinking of like the length tension recurve, is like the theories is that in those type of muscles, you're going to be able to basically use more of that. Whereas muscles that don't, like a lot of people, they look at that length tension curve and they look at the drop off and they look at that huge passive tension. And Tom Purvis actually has like a theoretical model on this of like, well, in real life, like how much of that lengthened tension curve of the individual sarcomere do we actually use? Because we don't use the same thing that happens in a lab where they cut the sarcomere out and they stretch it and let it shorten, like in a lab isolation out. It's not even a full, muscle cell. It's just a single sarcomere that they're basing that model off of. So it's very different compared to the sarcomere length changes that we would see, in a whole muscle in a real human, that has joint constraints and whatnot. So I think don't quote me on this, but if I remember right with his models, he's actually looking, it's like we're really only using about 40% of that length tension curve on like these single joint muscles. And maybe it's going up to, like 60, 70-ish% max for some of these biarticular muscles in terms of how much of that we would use. And then there's a lot of things that go on where it's just like when we're looking at muscle contractions, is that it's not necessarily uniform, meaning that like, if you were to look at all of the sarcomeres in my bicep as I was doing a curl, they're one, not all the same length, and two, they wouldn't all necessarily be shortening or lengthening to the same degree, which is, a big proposed mechanism for regional hypertrophy, as well as is like, okay, well, in certain muscles or whatnot, like some sarcomeres may be getting more passive tension than other sarcomeres within that same muscle.
Yep.
And yeah, I have a question. And is that why I know in some research, like they will take, I believe that the term is like cross-sectional area of like maybe 5 different locations down like the quadricep and measure regional hypertrophy. And with what you were saying is that, let's say theoretically, why they would not have equal hypertrophy at each of those cross-sectional areas in those research studies?
Yeah, so when it comes to regional hypertrophy, basically you have two influences, right? You have one is going to be the activation of those different regions, right? This is like, all right, are you able to actually activate a certain portion of that muscle a little bit more in one portion of the range relative to another, right? So the literal stimulus across the muscle can be uneven. And then the other thing would be like, well, okay, what about the asymmetry within the muscle, right? Are certain regions of that muscle, exposing themselves to a little bit more of that, passive stretch and getting a little bit more stretch mediated hypertrophy. And those two things aren't necessarily going to be totally separate, right? Because obviously the influence of how short the sarcomeres are is, because of the stimulus, but there's also some passive structure influence on there, right? Like there's give and take, like we're putting an impulse into that tissue that's saying, hey, shorten, but then also the resistance in the passive structures are dictating, well, how much shortening occurs relative to how much, resistance that particular series of sarcomeres has at that moment in time. So it's this balance of, what you're trying to signal in versus what, resistance there is on that particular region of the tissue. And so we get this, non-symmetrical, we'll say, stimulus and stress in the muscle, between that balance of what our nervous system is trying to do versus what's happening from the physics and the passive structures at any given range of motion.
Got it.
Cool. So just kind of generally, where do you see like the current state of the literature research on muscle lengths? We have, maybe at the top of my head, I can think of like 4 or 5 studies, but I'm sure that there's more that have looked into this at some level, maybe not as the specific focus of the study, but maybe it's like a tangential piece of it where some information was gathered. But how do you kind of see the research currently, and just kind of general overviews on it, and then we can take it from there?
Well, I'll start this with one of the huge limitations, and both of you guys haven't taken our course and actually looking at, the actual full range of motion of some of these muscles, is you immediately could say like, well, we don't actually have much research on true fully lengthened muscles. Like, it just literally, like, there's not really any research on like the actual true end ranges in the fully stretched positions. We just have, some research on, a little bit more stretch than others or whatever, right? Like if we're looking at the seated leg curl, like, I mean, if in a seated leg curl, you're getting the hamstrings pretty stretched. But if we were really talking about stretching each of those individual heads of the hamstrings, we would actually need slightly different hip positions, right? Same thing for, biceps and triceps and stuff. So it's like just going into the sagittal plane and then coming up here, like this, is not necessarily the best way to put the stretch on the long head, because we know it could actually get a little bit more direct stretch in the scapular plane. So what we do have, right, is biased towards lengthened positions having a greater magnitude of hypertrophy when that volume and effort is like in a 1-to-1 scale, right? And I would say essentially, if you look at everything that we have, there's either showing that it's biased towards the lengthened position, or there was no difference. But in a lot of those, like, there was no difference, or it was a statistically insignificant difference. Usually it's like, well, the actual lengthened exercise wasn't very lengthened, right? So you, like, in terms of like say, for instance, like the leg extension study, I mean, that study really showed a lengthened bias, but it still wasn't like full. I mean, because you just can't quite get a full stretch in a leg extension because the machine like literally just gets in the way, right? You can't get, hamstring calf like squish like you could in the bottom of a pendulum squat, right? Or a sissy squat or something like that. And that still shows that trend. So of the body of research we have, it suggests that. But, some of the arguments against that, would be, it's like, well, we have these other things that don't. And I would say, I wouldn't say like, well, okay, this didn't show that the lengthened thing was better. But I would also say, I don't necessarily think that debunks it, because the lengthened exercise wasn't really lengthened, right? So an example of that would be, they did like kind of what they did in the leg extension, but they did a preacher curl, and they did like different ranges of motion in a preacher curl. But a preacher curl is not anywhere close to a lengthened bicep. So comparing a lengthened partial in a preacher curl to a shortened partial in a preacher curl isn't really giving us, it's like, that's not the context that we're looking at of like, well, what about if we were getting this like more stretch-mediated hypertrophy? Because you're not getting any of that length that you would at the shoulder. So, in that instance, it might just not have gotten lengthened enough for the difference to be statistically significant, right? So I guess if I kind of like wrap this up, is there definitely seems to be a bias in the research towards lengthened exercises being better for hypertrophy in a 1-to-1 volume scale, right? But there is like also some stuff that just isn't very contextual, that shows that, maybe for some muscles, it doesn't make as big of a difference once we start getting away from that really stretched position. So my interpretation is this, basically, if I wrap this up, is that I think that, across the muscles, lengthened exercises are probably going to be better for hypertrophy, but how much better may differ from different muscles. Right, meaning that not every muscle is going to have the same magnitude increase in its lengthened position, compared to others, because it's going to depend on for instance, like, is it a biarticular muscle, and what is its average circumlunar length, and like how much stretch does it get? And then because we're humans limited to the logistics that we have in training, it's also just, well, what is our technical ability to actually go to those positions and load them? Because when it comes to like the quads and the hamstrings, like we don't have the ability to load them like we do things with the arm, where we can go to like basically any plane of motion that we want. We're kind of stuck to like, well, what can I do in these like machines or hinge type movements or leg extension, leg curl type movements, because we just don't have the ability to articulate our feet and hips and hold weights like that, right? I guess if we still had like an opposable thumb on our foot, maybe that would open up some more lower body hypertrophy options. So who knows?
I did, and I thought it would be a really good example. So you were you briefly mentioned using like a preacher curl, right? And saying, hey, they use this in the study, but it isn't, a preacher curl isn't actually a fully lengthened bicep. And I thought just for the listeners, it could be a really good explanation as to like why that isn't fully lengthened.
Yeah, so because the biceps cross both the elbow joint and the shoulder joint, right? You could be in full elbow extension, meaning like you're stretching the biceps as much around the elbow as you possibly can. But if you're not also stretching them around the shoulder, that means you aren't getting them near as stretched as you could if you are both doing elbow extension and shoulder extension, like in the example we used at the beginning of the discussion, which would be like an incline curl or something where you're basically your shoulder is being pulled into extension, and then you'd also be doing so. In that instance, you're stretching the bicep around two joints versus you're kind of shortening it at the shoulder and lengthening it at the elbow in a preacher curl. So it's not going to be as much of a stretch.
So it's interesting looking at the hamstring study where I understand what you're saying, where you didn't get it like fully lengthened because, you need to manipulate hip positions for the different heads of the hamstring. But we can just say a seated leg curl is a lengthened hamstring, more or less. Like it's as close to lengthened as you're going to get there. Whereas the leg extension study and the bicep curl study, what they essentially did was test overloading what is the lengthened portion of the movement, but not necessarily taking the muscle to long muscle lengths. And so they were comparing it like, okay, let's make this hardest at whatever the range of motion is that we're using at the bottom. Whereas the hamstring study didn't necessarily manipulate where the movement was hardest, but it just was like, hey, we're going to train at long muscle lengths. So I just wanted to point that out, and that was interesting. And then the other interesting thing about the preacher curl study is that the bottom range of motion piece was done with a barbell, or an easy bar or whatever, and the top range of motion was done with a cable. So they weren't exactly comparing one to one there. The barbell or easy bar is inherently going to be harder at the bottom until gravity allows you to kind of get it past horizontal, right? Whereas the cable is just kind of going to be harder based on the mechanical disadvantage that you have as the muscle gets shorter. Is that a good way of saying it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a few different studies, so I just want to make sure we're talking about the same one. So the leg extension one used partials, right? So, but it was, so it wasn't a change in resistance profile. It was basically the same resistance, but they did like a partial only versus a, whatever.
Well, they went heavier, I believe, for the bottom range of motion.
Well,
right?
it was standardized though to what you could do at that, right? Because basically they tested to see what your rep max. So the weight was equated to your strength at that position, if that makes sense, right?
Yes. So inevitably you were going to use more weight at the lengthened portion of
it. So even though it's more like there was physical mass or whatever that they used on the machine, in terms of the muscle challenge, it would have been like the same RPE or RIR. So that standardized, right? So essentially that would have been accomplishing the same thing as if you were to say, if we set up the leg extension so that it would have been equally hard through the whole rep, if you would, right? Now, when it comes to the elbow flexion stuff, the preacher curl, there's two studies. One, like you said, used the barbell and the cable. And then there's another one that I believe just used the barbell, but they did a mid-range partial compared to a full range, right? And in that one, the full range did a little bit better. So you could interpret that as like, well, full ROM seemed to be a little bit better, or it's that, well, that one did include more of the stretch, but which was those things? Was it more total ROM or more total stretch, right? But yeah, and the one where you have the cable and the easy bar, I would say they're trying to accomplish the same thing in that leg extension, meaning that they purposely made sure that the partial range that they were training in was still being adequately loaded. So again, if you were to have a preacher curl machine, because like on the machines, basically you can make it so that the resistance stays constant. But when you have a free weight, like with a dumbbell, like once your hand is over your elbow, a dumbbell or a barbell or easy bar, whatever it is it's no longer going to weigh very much, right? Whereas the cable, once it's in line with your arm, isn't going to be much. So it's when it's perpendicular to your arm. So I don't know why. I can't, speculate why, but my guess is that they chose to use those two things so that they could simulate the same resistance in those two different positions, if that makes sense, right? But but because they did the partial for the cable at the top, and then they did the partial for the easy bar at the bottom, right? They basically were keeping the exercise where it was mostly loaded, right? So it wouldn't have been very good to do an easy bar. Imagine trying to effort equate an easy bar curl where you only did like the top quarter. You just have to have like a tremendous amount of load that you were basically just like swinging back and forth. So who knows, maybe that was like one of the decisions, right? Plus then in that instance, it would be so heavy that if you accidentally went down just like an extra half of an inch, you'd, blow out both of your biceps because you're trying to easy bar curl 300 pounds and you can really only easy bar curl like 35 pounds. So anyway, just to clarify kind of what those are, so that if somebody has read any of those things, they kind of know where we're coming from.
Yeah, so I think I was maybe thinking mostly of that cable versus like the top position with the cable, or versus the bottom position with the bar. And then you said there was the other one where they just did a barbell, but they did a full range.
They compared full range to like a mid-range partial. Right.
And the full range
the full range was marginally better, right? So in both of those elbow flexion studies, there was a very, very small, like statistically insignificant bias towards the lengthened position. Right. But it was very, very small. But again, you're not getting that lengthened. So I don't know, like in those exercises, are they just barely hitting the point where you would have gotten some of those lengthened benefits, right? Like, they're just barely touching it. And that's why the difference was, so small.
Yeah. Very interesting.
One thing I did think of that was pretty funny is when, Cass, you were just talking about doing like the easy bar curl at just like the top portion of the shortened portion of the bar bicep, and it reminded me of like in high school we would do these bicep curls like the 21s where you would just do like the bottom 7 like top 7 and then like a full 7. And it just reminded me of like, yeah, the top was like you were just going through the motions because it was so easy, and I had no idea of why. And now like literally 20 years later I'm like, oh, that's why. So I just thought it was pretty funny.
Yeah. Order wrong on that sequence.
Yeah. It's a lot easier to move weights horizontally than it is to lift them vertically, believe it or not, right?
Okay, cool. Well, so as we've kind of covered, a lot of the background, people are probably pretty familiar with some of the studies that are out there on the lengths and the overload and stuff like that. What you've kind of touched on this already, but maybe in more succinctly, like what are the benefits of training at long muscle lengths?
So, well, I think, there's benefits from we'll say an orthopaedic and a neurological perspective of just having competency in all ranges of motion that you would use. But when we're talking about hypertrophy, and this is an area where I feel like the terms don't help very much because passive tension is the thing that's technically, or that's typally used. Is that, okay, if as we're going into the stretch, you're getting more passive tension. But if you've been reading the research, that comes after like the 1970s, that like the cross-bridge model we have, like the sliding filament theory, where it's like, okay, actin and myosin are, they're crawling wrong, and that's what, creates the tension. We now have the three-filament theory, which is where titin is basically included in part of this process, because now what we know is that titin isn't just a passive mechanism of just something that gets stretched just because we get it long, but titin actively participates. So Essentially, if anybody knows how a contraction works, essentially, your nerve sends a signal down, and basically what happens is that you basically push calcium into the muscle tissue, right? And that's like that's like going from the nervous system to the actual contractile tissue. That's the first part of that contraction, right? And then that leads down to the cascade where, we eventually, we use ATP and whatever, and we do all the little cross bridging crawling things. But titin is actually calcium sensitive. So that means as part of this, like once you're engaging that calcium release, it's not just affecting the cross bridging of actin and myosin, but it's actually changing the rigidity or the elasticity of the titin molecule. So that means that when you're actually activating a tissue, titin is becoming more tense and becoming part of the tension process earlier, right, at a shorter muscle length than if you were to be completely relaxed and passively stretch it. So there's an active component to titin. So the way I'm kind of looking at this, I don't know if anybody else, will agree, is I'm looking at it as kind of like we have motor-based tension. It comes from like a myosin chain is called like a, it's a motor unit, but like you have like a motor complex. So I think like the motor tension that's actually the cross bridging. That's the little heads of the actin and myosin just crawling along each other, right? Like active Velcro. So then what we have is we have non-motor active tension, which is basically calcium affecting the protein folding of that titin, which affects like basically how much it's pulling and how stretchy or elastic it is. And then we'd have completely passive, and that would basically be, well, titin and then whatever structural proteins are around there that are now being stretched, but there's no biochemical influence. So it's just whatever they have in the absence of being stimulated, right? So when we're doing resistance training, we're never actually doing like purely passive passive tension, because of like, or you shouldn't be, right? Like this should be an active process. Like you're doing an eccentric, you're doing a concentric, right? But like you're actively controlling that load. There's impulse going into that. So it's good. Like that muscle's going to be in a state where yes, there's calcium influx in there. And so titin is going to be more stiff and providing more tension than it would in a completely passive environment. So when we look at lengthened positions, it's not just the passive that they would get from the stretch, right? But it's also then like it's once we say, all right, we're activating this tissue, now we're getting even exaggerated. And I think that's why exercises that we'll say don't fit that like sarcomere model where it's like, oh, this should be getting passive tension or shouldn't be getting passive tension because people are looking at like optimal sarcomere length. Well, because that's only in a passive state that they'd be seeing that passive tension curve. When we apply the three-filament model, we see like, well, that titin molecule is becoming active way early, right? And that's essentially allowing us to increase the amount of mechanical tension that we can get earlier as a muscle stretches, right? And so the benefits of the lengthened position, I'm coming around to this, are that essentially all of the non-motor tension, whether that be active or passive, right, not only has a greater capacity for total tension, but it allows us to accumulate a higher volume of tension in a set because it's not ATP dependent, right? So that means the more you're getting into the lengthened position, the cheaper it is for you to create mechanical tension. So that means as you're doing a set, you can do more mechanical tension before you metabolically are no longer to be able to create the motor-based tension, right? So not only can you achieve a greater magnitude of tension with the non-motor-based and passive tension contribution of titin, but you do so in a way that isn't limited by the energy system in terms of you being able to recycle that ADP back to ATP and continue the motor-based portion of the contraction. So when we're looking at mechanical tension being the main stimulus for hypertrophy, lengthened positions probably allow us to accumulate a higher amount per rep and a greater amount per set.
That's really well said. I feel like in my mind, and this could be totally wrong, but like when I'm envisioning is someone has like an accordion with like teeny holes in it, and as the accordion extends out, that's like your muscle lengthening, and then all of these little things can like the different molecules can get in through these like teeny little porous places in the accordion, and then when it pushes back together, that's like the contracted position sort of, and all of those molecules that you've gotten in there are like now creating all of this incredible pain through all the metabolite buildup and stuff like that, and you're feeling it. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's what I was thinking as you were talking.
Yeah, I mean that's they refer to the titin molecule as is like an active spring, when they're kind of describing its function, right? But we'll say it's a chemical sensitive spring. So, a regular spring, the more you stretch it, the more it pulls, right? So it does increase its tensile strength with stretch, but then there's additional component of like, well, when this tissue is active, it's like that. It's like the equivalent of making that spring like even more robust and having a greater, tensile capacity, right? So you have two influences, both how much stretch, but also how much activation on top of that.
So kind of based on the way you describe that, like my next question was going to be, so what's more important, training at long muscle lengths or training where that it's hardest in the stretched position of the exercise? But I kind of feel like listening to you talk about all that maybe the answer is just that there needs to be some tension at the stretched position. It doesn't necessarily need to be the hardest there, but as long as it's not like a docile tension that where nothing's happening, then you should be fine. And then alternatively, maybe you just don't necessarily want to make it hardest in the short position unless you're trying to specifically make that like a short overloaded movement. But an even resistance curve, training at long muscle lengths would theoretically be as effective as an even resistance curve where it's just slightly harder at the lengthened position. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so what you have to think of is like as you stretch, you're getting passive tension. But the amount of passive tension is determined by how much loading there is at that stretch. So the two things are, they're part of the same equation. They're multipliers of each other, right? Now, if you look at this through the window of a single rep, this is the flaw that I think a lot of people do. They look at things as like too isolated. Like they're trying to decide about an exercise based off of a single sarcomere, based on a single repetition, and that's not what we do, right? We don't pull our sarcomeres out, train them one maximum intention, and then put them back in, and then hope that they're well stimulated. Were you able to use multiple repetitions, right? So there's a time part of this like volume of tension that we're able to accumulate. So essentially, it's like, well, if the more length you get, well, then the more of that passive non-motor tension you're going to get, but also the more load in that stretch, then the more that you're going to get. But if it's not maximally loaded, you're still, because essentially you're not using as much energy in those stretch positions, you're still going to accumulate some of that non-motor tension. You're just going to do it across more reps than fewer reps. So this is why, and I believe I may have said this in the last podcast or whatever, is that I think you just need to have a resistance profile that's good enough, right? You don't want it to be like absolutely nothing, right? But it also doesn't have to be like, well, if I'm going to do a leg lengthened exercise, it needs to be absolutely as hard as possible in the lengthened position, right? I think there's probably a point of diminishing returns of it being too much, and there's a threshold where it's like, this is enough now, because as I do reps, I'm still gonna accumulate that. And I would say a good way to kind of monitor this, like if because it'll vary so much by individual, all sorts of adaptations and your joint angles and insertion points, so many factors going into this. So what's the just how do I know thing? Is this really just look at where you fail, right? Is this like, if you're doing an exercise and basically on the last rep, you go from being able to do a full rep to then just absolutely nothing. Well, then the profile might be biased a little too hard to the lengthened position, right? Essentially what you kind of want is that your last rep, you can go from like doing like a slow full rep to then maybe grinding out a half to 3/4 of a rep, right? And that might mean that your profile is fairly balanced, right? But if you can't do at least like a half of a rep, then you might be on the like too lengthened side or whatever. And this isn't a hard rule. This is just kind of a general thing of people like being able to know like, okay, for me, am I being overly like overly neurotic about trying to really challenge this lengthened position to where it's like, I was good, and then I suddenly got pinned, because it's like, well, maybe you left a couple reps on the table if you wouldn't have had such an aggressive profile, right? And then on the other end, where it's like, okay, as I start to fail, I actually only lose like a tenth of a rep, and I can go and go and go and go. Well, they're probably not loading the lengthened position very much, and it's probably all in the short position. And so you're able to just like keep doing those reps that are just like getting small, like just dropping a few percentage points on total range of motion, right? So the sweet spot is probably you hit failure and you get, a half a rep or a little bit more if you were to do that like one rep, the -1 RIR, if you will, right?
I literally just made a post on that this morning where I was saying use your first partial rep to determine where the overload has occurred in the movement. So that's cool that you co-sign on that. I feel like I could have said it better, but no, that's really interesting. And I also think it's really interesting that you said that you should be able to get, generally like 50, 60, 70% range of motion on that first partial, because on something like that is very lengthened overloaded, like you have your pendulum or whatever, like unless you're changing the way that your intent out of the bottom of the movement, where you're now incorporating adductors and glutes and all these different muscles, you're probably not going to make it to halfway on the rep that you fail, right? Whereas, and same thing, like similarly on the dual cable lateral raise, like very lengthened overload profile, you're going to go until your arm gets perpendicular to the cable, which is going to be 20 degrees or something like that. It's not going to be a ton. So those movements are inherently going to be much more lengthened, overloaded. And then you look at something like a cable row or a dumbbell lateral raise, and that's the example of you're losing 5 or 10% each rep, and you could probably do failure at 10 and then hit 10 more partials before there's nothing left. So ultimately, we may want to just try to look to be somewhere in between those two extremes.
Yeah. Another thing you can do if that's too hard for you to figure out, like if you're doing partials, would be like, all right, if you were going to do partials, if you can do like 30 of them, it's probably not very hard in the lengthened position, right? But if you can only get like, I mean, obviously the loading, matters, right? But let's say like you're going to do like, let's say Brian, you did a set of 12, on a pendulum or whatever, right? Like, I mean, it's, in general, I tend not to use partials in very lengthened biased exercises, because
of course not. Yeah,
that's just like, it's like your partial is like, well, I'm sitting at the bottom until somebody helps me get up. That's how you do partials in a pendulum or a bench press. Like it just doesn't work, very well. Like maybe you get like one, like for instance, if you're doing a bench press, you might get like that half a rep, and then that was it, right? And then it's like, okay, maybe I could like push it a few inches off my chest or whatever, and then it's just like the scream for help for somebody to come and rescue you type of thing. So generally, when we're doing lengthened biased exercises, it's not, partials aren't something that I'm going to use very often. But if it is a safe condition, like you're using cables or something like that, right? Like you could do a cable press and then you could work in partials there, because, if you get stuck at the bottom, it's no big deal. You just let the cable back, right? Like there's no imminent risk of needing dental work after your set when you're doing it that way. So in those instances, you could be like, well, in a lengthened based exercise, I'm probably only going to be able to get, 1, 2, maybe 3, like little whatever partial reps, right? And they're going to be progressively smaller, like a half rep, and then maybe like a quarter rep, and then like, a tenth or an eighth of a rep or something like that. So as another way of kind of looking at that is like, if you did decide to do partials, you shouldn't be able to do very many of them if it's truly lengthened bias.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I actually put that in my post today that I wouldn't recommend doing, partials on a pendulum or an RDL or a back squat, because essentially what happens is you do just get pinned at the bottom. The cable press is a good option too, but like I prefer, if I'm going to do a past failure type thing on a lengthened overload movement, I think like a rest pause or a myo rep thing makes a lot more sense. But more the point of my post was to demonstrate that, hey, the movements that you should be doing partials on potentially are probably the ones where you can get most of the range of motion, because they're so short overloaded. So we're definitely on all of the same pages there. And I think that transfers us pretty well into the next question of why train short.
Yep. So we talked about how with the lengthened position, you can get more tension per rep, more tension per set. And part of that happens because passive tension allows you just to simply create more tension, but also that it doesn't require you to produce as much energy, right? It's not as ATP dependent. So training in the short position, you are actually challenging the energy system more. So that's why we use short positions more for metabolic phases, because we're actually challenging our ability to, continue to fuel the motor portion of that contraction more by biasing the range of motion to where it's more energy demanding, right? So you have that aspect there that you're getting a stimulus that you might not be getting if you're doing the lengthened position, right? In the short position, it might be more of an ATP within that actual contractile fiber, your ability to recycle that's the fatigue mechanism. Where in the lengthened position, right, not only do we get calcium coming in when we stimulate a muscle, but also as a muscle gets stretched, it basically opens up pores for calcium to even flow in at a higher degree. That's why, so basically if you're being passively stretched, that's a way of actually getting some signal to that titin molecule to tighten up, even in the absence of activation, so that you wouldn't just all of a sudden put all of that tension on the structural tissues of the muscle and just, tear it in half. So that leads to to an excitation coupling fatigue, meaning that literally the ability for you to pull that calcium back out of the tissue or back out of the sarcomere, right, actually becomes a limiting factor for not only fatigue acutely, but also fatigue long term until you get to the next session. That's one of the reasons, on top of damage and stuff like that, of why lengthened exercises tend to potentially produce more DOMs, and take longer to recover, full strength and whatnot, and be ready to train again. So with shortened positions exercises, we do push that metabolic demand, right? We're kind of training that ATP system a little bit more, but we're also not getting that neurological fatigue in the same way, right? We're not getting that fatigue through the calcium mechanism. So it works well in that you're able to kind of shift the stimulus, but also you're able to change your tolerance to volume and frequency and stuff like that. And you could say that from a motor pattern perspective, I might say it's short positions might be really good for increasing amplitude, because you're so focused on the active portion of the contraction, right? So I think doing short position exercises, both are important, but I think training both of those is very good for orthopedic health, because it kind of maintains your ability to control that muscle throughout its full range of motion. And you're likely getting slightly neurological benefits from each of those type of things, meaning that if you're going to do full ROM exercises, or say you're going to do dynamic exercises, you were going to do some cleans or snatches or throw a ball or whatever, right? And all of a sudden, now you're going into extreme ranges and you're using a combination of, a lot of stretch mediated stuff in one position and then other stuff in there, as you're just going to increase your tolerance to that changing environment of using stretch and then needing to be more active, et cetera. So I think from a injury prevention standpoint and a functional standpoint, training both is good. And I think that if you're switching goals, that basically that short position offers you an opportunity to use volume more as a driver than because essentially it's in a short position exercise, you may not get as much mechanical tension per rep, because you're not able to use the passive part that gets you way more tension. And also you might be limited by the energy system, but you might be able to tolerate more sets and more frequency. So this is where, when we look at the research that's comparing short and long positions in a 1-to-1, it doesn't tell us, well, what if I did 8 sets of the short exercises compared to 6 sets of the lengthened exercise? Or what if by doing more short exercises, I could train the muscle, every, 4 days instead of every 6 days, or whatever it may be. It's all right, would I be able then to kind of balance out that difference in hypertrophy stimulus because of my tolerance to volume changes, right? So would I still be able to accomplish that, right? And there's nothing in the research to say either way on that right now, but I would say that in practice, the anecdotes that I do have, I think that, especially in beginners, using that higher volume or higher frequency of short position exercises, I think definitely produces decent results, right? But I think as you get a little bit more advanced, that energy system may just be too much of a limiter, right? You eventually reach a point where it's like, look, I tried like adding volume and adding frequency to balance these things out. And at a certain point, as you advance, you just need more. And that just becomes not a very efficient way of going about it, right? So it's like, okay, better to choose the option that maybe doesn't have a little bit less or as much volume and whatnot. The other thing I will say is I think that our ability to adapt to the fatigue of each type of those stimulus. So if you'll notice that if you start metabolic training, you get much better really fast at that type of training, right? And then if you do lengthen based exercises, you'll notice that like, man, they might really tear you up that first week. But by just the second or third time that you do them, the amount of soreness and how quickly you recover from them changes dramatically. And to me, that means that, we're adapting specific to that stress. So maybe like as you're doing lengthened exercises, you increase your capacity to rebalance that calcium, whether that's like creating more calcium pumps, whether that's just like improving the energy system to be able to fuel those things or whatever. So there's probably like, a place where it's like, okay, in either one, periodization then becomes your tool, because you reach to a point where it's like, okay, I'm recovering from this really well. I got the sweet spot, and then I've gotten that stimulus, for a while. And then it's like, okay, if I go do the other thing, I'll kind of slightly detrain myself from that other stress for a little bit. I'll expose myself to a new stimulus and then jump back. And then in that instance, it might be like, well, okay, I'm going to be sore a little bit or whatever. But in the process of that, is that consequence actually then driving up my adaptations for that? So you guys know that I'm always interested in potentiation, right? Like, how can I use this week's training to make the next phases or the next better? And I think when you use both of these things, is that you're kind of potentiating that. And I know I'm kind of rambling here, but part of being able to rebalance calcium is dependent on the mitochondria's ability to both absorb calcium, but also to produce ATP to fuel those pumps and whatnot. So maybe in a way, directly training the metabolic system potentiates the ability for your tolerance to like how much recovery you could jack up from those lengthened position exercises, right? And so, and vice versa, right? So like if you're really, really good at, rebalancing calcium and restoring the nervous system, then that might increase the tolerance to volume of short exercises that you can do also. So it's like, I think both of these things, as you evolve, become better. Maybe I'll try this. I don't know how most of your listeners are visual, the YouTube probably, right? But the way I kind of look at it is imagine like you have two stimuluses that are overlapping. No, they're not. They're not visual. They're mostly listening. Okay, well, this won't work then, right? But essentially, the visual that I was going to give is that as you advance in training, right, essentially like these two stimuluses, they overlap less and they get further and further apart from each other. So that means your need to kind of periodize back and forth becomes better, because if I switch to one stimulus, right, not only am I able to push that a little harder, but because I'm deloading the other one basically kind of moves back to an easier trainability, if you will. It's like, okay, now I don't have to keep pushing that to as an extreme level. So if I do a metabolic phase for a couple of weeks, that means the progressions that I was needing to make to get progress in the hypertrophy phase might take a couple steps back, so I can get more out of less for a little bit as well, right? And then vice versa, right? So as you advance, I think utilizing both methods in isolation is very beneficial. Whereas if you're a beginner, you just do something and it's likely metabolically challenging and also stressful from a calcium level at the same time. And as you advance, it becomes like, well, one of those things is like going to start bottlenecking the other, and you're not going to be able to drive as much stimulus in either direction unless you kind of start specializing your training a bit. Okay, long ramble there. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that was great. So then does that mean that if you're trying to keep these stimuli separate, that maybe I was thinking you were on the side of, 60-ish, 65, 70% of movements in a hypertrophy phase being more lengthened overloaded, and then, 30 to 40% being short. Would you even skew more to lengthen so that you detrain a little bit from the short, and then vice versa when you're doing the alternative?
Well, let's say that like my threshold for a metabolic phase is like, I'm doing, 8 to 10 sets in the short position, right? And then I switch to a hypertrophy phase and I'm doing 3 sets or 4 sets, right? That likely is not now enough to not prevent, like, I mean, it might slow the detraining effect of that a little bit, but it's not enough to maintain it. So if I'm going to do 6, 8, 10 weeks of this hypertrophy meso, right, that's allowing me to maintain the neurological competency in those positions. It's a way of me being able to add maybe a little bit more volume that I otherwise wouldn't be able to because of the increased fatigue. But it's not enough to prevent me from also detraining a little bit from that, right? It's like let's look at this, for instance. Imagine that you run a 6-minute mile, right? So, and like you've trained yourself or whatever, a 7-minute mile, something more relatable, whatever. All right, you run a 7-minute mile. That's where you're at. Okay. Now, you could look at this as both an intensity or volume thing, right? But if you take whatever training that it took you to be able to run that 7-minute mile, right? And then all of a sudden you're like, well, I'm going to start running, 12-minute miles, right? I'm just going to go at a jogging pace, right? Or I'm going to run 3.5-minute half miles or something like that. Either or, if you do that for 8 weeks, you won't still be able to run the 7-minute mile, right? It might decrease how much your pace would drop off, like from week to week, because you're still like doing a little bit of it, right? But if you back that off for 10 weeks, you're not then going to maintain that same level of performance, right? Fortunately for hypertrophy, we tend to maintain contractile tissue, but in terms of like our actual performance and our response to these stress and whatnot, those things back off if we pull back the pedal like at all, right? So. And you could look at that as strength too, like, right? If your 1RM is whatever, say your 1RM in bench press is, 400 pounds. If you all of a sudden just start like, only doing singles with 375, if you do that for 10 weeks, odds are that your 1RM is going to be closer to 375 if you don't ever, it's basically reversing progressive overload, right? It's regressive underload, or whatever. I think that's a thing that some people say as a joke or whatever, right? But that's essentially what you're doing is you're like reversing the principle of progressive overload, and that's going to be enough to get some resensitization or some detraining in that other stimulus. It doesn't have to be I do 0, because there is no such thing, right? Like there's no way to keep training and for it to be 0 metabolic stimulus, right, and 0 mechanical stress. Like we're just moving the scale on a continuum a little bit.
Interesting. So do you have any thoughts, Aaron, before I continue here real quick?
I do. I mean, the biggest thing that I kind of was picking up, or the way that my brain was thinking mostly from what I do, mostly like being a nutrition coach, is leveraging more of the shortened positions and more metabolic style phasing with clients who are transitioning into a calorie deficit to really get things moving. Or if we are in one and we are maybe having some like glucose sensitivity issues or something like that, by training these systems, by really trying to cut a large hole in the bucket to get more, glycogen depleting, or even so like a glycogen depletion type thing if someone needs to make a weight for something like that quickly. Those were just kind of some of the thoughts, or where my mind was initially going for where I will have the most practical use case with my clientele.
Yeah, absolutely. The short position, because of that metabolic demand, is going to give you we call it like, we'll call it an AMPK phase or a nutrient partitioning phase, right? Is that you're going to see adaptations that correlate with that stress, right? So that means that you're going to hold more hold more of those GLUT4 proteins, the things that actually, respond to insulin and pull glucose in the cell membrane at all times. You're also going to have a higher amount of them in there. You're going to have more enzymes to create glycogen so that you can make more, all of that. And you'll have mitochondrial adaptations in there as well to be able to replenish that fuel. And you basically become like, 2 things happen, when we're doing this metabolic training is that your body gets more carb stingy and increases carb storage, right, in terms of glucose, right? So it's like it's trying to find 2 strategies to increase its savings account for glucose. One is to take up more, and the other is to increase its capacity to use fat for fuel so that it needs to dip into that account less. So, from a conditioning perspective or a body composition perspective, those are extremely favorable adaptations, and then you add on top of that the benefit of like, well, you can use a little bit more volume and a little bit more training frequency, which is going to get you, a little bit more, just overall energy, burned without the same soreness and, recovery things, right? So like one of the things that we do is like, whether it's fat loss or hypertrophy, whatever, like you have somebody coming in from a beginning and it's like, man, if we can make people better at storing carbs and utilizing fat, that's going to make their journey better. And if they're new to training, if I can give them a program that isn't just going to kick them in their metaphorical nuts, like with like just retarded levels of DOMs right away, and it's actually going to be like stuff that actually makes them feel more full and more pumped or whatever, it's like that's a huge psychological benefit. Is just like, hey, there's a lot more reward and a lot less pain than I otherwise could have experienced if I was like, okay, it's first program or whatever. What are we doing? Well, we're doing heel elevated pause squats, right? So you're not going to be able to walk for 9 days, when it's like, oh no, we're going to do like leg extensions with like, a shortened overload or pause at the top or something like that. And it's like, cool, especially like I look at the way we do like an AMPK, like the IRMs, is just like, that's the way to reverse engineer the physiology that's causing people to be skinny fat, right? Which is like they're nutrient partitioning away from muscle. And it's like, we want you to switch over. Mm-hmm. And the visual change that you can get in those people just simply because we're increasing the hydration of that muscle tissue can be extremely motivating, in the same way that like if you have somebody like cut their carbohydrates at the beginning of a diet, that initial weight loss can be like, oh wow, okay, now I'm bought in, I'm motivated. You can use these metabolic training stimuluses the same way, that like, oh man, I could just, my muscles, they just feel fuller throughout the week, I can see them, I can feel the pump, and it's not like I'm not so sore. It's not like, okay, in order to do that, like I couldn't now do my daily activities for like the next 3 days without like, regretting like, or fearing having to go to the bathroom because I don't want to sit on the toilet, like pain, right? So, I mean, there's so many reasons to use this stuff outside of just like, hey, which one makes me bigger, faster, bro? Right? That it just ultimately lead to a person's success.
Yep. No, that's super well said. And then you mentioned, just to close the short position thing, you mentioned driving volume as a good reason to use these movements. And so practically for a listener, I think the way to conceptualize that would be something like a specialization phase, where maybe you have one or two muscle groups that you really want to drive volume for, but we'll use the glutes because you were just on with Brett. And so if you want to do a glute priority phase, you can only squat, deadlift, and lunge so many days a week without just constantly being sore. So doing things like banded work that overloads the short position and thrusts and bridges and things like that may have more applicability in a phase where you're trying to train the glutes 5 times a week instead of twice a week as part of a generally well-rounded program.
Yeah. And this is where I think like there's that, like, it's important to look at that threshold, right? Because it's like, we'll put it this way. If you can do it 5 days a week, what does that likely mean for the stimulus that you're getting each one of those times? Or is there a point of diminishing returns? Like, I would say probably that number probably exists somewhere around 3 times per week, right? Meaning that, if we're looking at what would actually produce the best results, is if you can do it more than 3, 4, definitely for sure max. That means like you're probably per session stimulus is suffering too much now, right? So it's like, okay, your volume is now too inefficient. So I think there's going to be a sweet spot, where it's like, if you just do all lengthened exercises or whatever, you might only be able to hit something once every 7 to 10 days, right? If you're doing a lot of volume, right? So, okay, you split that up and you can maybe do it 2 times a week. You maybe take some of that stuff and you add in a little bit more short based exercises. Now maybe you can tolerate that 3 times, per week, right? You start abandoning most of the lengthened stuff and doing a tremendous amount of low efficient exercises. And now it's like, oh yeah, every day is glute day, right? And that usually puts people into a place where it's like, okay, maybe you're still making progress, but it's a very inefficient in terms of like how much time it's taking you to get that progress. But also, are you actually getting as much progress over that time as you can? Right? Because it's like, all right, if you can get the same results in 3 hours a week versus 5 to 6 hours a week, I would say, well, probably the 3 hours a week would be the more time efficient, right? Especially if you actually start seeing a point of diminishing returns when you get to like that, over 4 to 5 hours a week of training for that body part, right? Then it's like, okay, I'm actually getting less out of more time, right? So that's the caveat that I would throw on there. So there's just a point of diminishing returns with applying that principle, right? And same thing for the other direction, right? Like if you get to the point where you can only train something once every, 10 days because you're just annihilating it, that's probably not a very efficient approach either, right? Because you're probably leaving a lot of stimulus on the table if you're limited to such a low frequency.
Yeah. Are you cool for another 15 minutes or so?
Yeah, I'm good.
Sweet. All right, there's a question that I absolutely have to ask because I've received more DMs over the last 2 weeks of people sending me Paul Carter's messages or posts about muscles not responding to long muscle lengths. And so the way, just to frame this up for listeners, essentially, there's this guy, Chester Soko. He's got a PhD. He posts pretty polarizing stuff on his Instagram, and he's super hard on the lengthened bandwagon. Like he basically, I've seen him write things along the lines of like, Paul Carter's just an overgrown gorilla who knows nothing. Like all muscles respond to stretch-mediated hypertrophy, etc. And then Paul's been coming out with all of these statements and posts recently that the biceps and triceps specifically do not respond advantageously to stretch-mediated hypertrophy. I think his most recent statement was that they're equal, that you can do lengthened overload movements, but they're no better than the short version for those muscles. And then obviously Brett tried to manufacture an argument that the glutes also respond better to short overloaded movements. So what are your thoughts on the whole, what muscles respond better to lengthen versus short? And is there anything to what Paul is saying about the biceps and triceps?
Okay, so if you think back on when we were talking about, motor versus non-motor tension, right? So that three-filament model lets us see that we are getting non-motor based tension like pretty early in the lengthening of a sarcomere, right? Like, pretty early. And even if you look at like the chart that Brett put up or whatever, he's got this passive tension line and this active tension line. You see that the active tension line starts climbing like fairly early, right? I mean, it's not a lot, but it's climbing very early. And that's completely passive. So that's not including what we would be getting. So in essence, if we understand that, by working in the lengthened position, even if we're getting the same amount of total tension like in a rep, that we're actually able to accumulate a little bit more volume of that tension because it's not as ATP dependent, then I would say like I think my position is that I think all muscles are going to benefit on from a hypertrophy perspective from being a little bit more lengthened bias, simply because you can accumulate that volume of tension you can accumulate it a little bit easier. But not every muscle will have the same magnitude of difference, right? So for some, it may make a huge difference, and for some, it might be a small difference. So if I'm going to try and steelman Paul's argument or whatever, which is basically looking at the sarcomere length and saying, hey, in these muscles, because of the length of those sarcomeres, that they're not getting as much passive tension as other muscles, right? That might have a different sarcomere length throughout their range of motion. Then I can be like, yeah, so it might be a thing that like, all right, compared to the quads, the biceps don't see as big of a magnitude improvement. But I still think basically if you load it properly and you actually get a decent stretch, that all of those muscles are going to slightly favor that. It's just some are going to make less of a difference than others. I think there's going to be that discrepancy, but if we could look at it at the granular level, we could say like, well, I think all muscles are going to have stretch-mediated responses. Like it wouldn't make sense that we would have muscles in the body that just don't have that mechanism. Like it just doesn't happen in them, because it would actually restrict the types of adaptations that those tissues could have and whatnot. And then there is just some flaws in looking at that single sarcomere model and then trying to apply that to a whole muscle in real life training. And part of that is that, in a muscle, the sarcomeres don't necessarily symmetrically contract across the entire muscle length, right? So that means that we could actually be getting some sarcomeres to a greater stretch, right, than what you would otherwise think on average, because some would be shortening a little bit more and some would be getting a little bit more relative lengthen. But on average, as you lengthen a muscle, more of them are going to be closer to the stretch, and as you shorten it, more of them are going to be closer to shorten. But that doesn't mean that it's this like linear shortening and lengthening process across the whole muscle. So with that, and then the regional differences and stuff like that, I'm pretty confident in saying I think stretch-mediated hypertrophy or non-motor based, contribution of the stimulus is going to apply to every tissue, but the magnitude is going to be different. So like most things, the answer is kind of somewhere in the middle of what both of those people are saying. It's not just like, hey, if you just do lengthened exercises, then you just get way, way, way better results in everything. It's going to make more of a difference in some tissues than other, right? And then there's the whole thing is like, well, in the things that it's not making as much difference, can we make up for that with just, volume or putting training at a relatively higher degree of effort or whatever it is, just like, because you need, like, for mechanical tension, that stimulus it's a volume that's dependent on both magnitude and time, right? So that means that we can use more sets. Like that's the thing. So that's where then I think part of Paul's argument is like, well, because lengthened exercises are more fatiguing, he's like, well, if they're the same, I wouldn't do the lengthened one because he's looking at them as more fatiguing. But my argument would be is that the fatigue is going to be proportion to the amount of benefit, right? Because if you can't stretch it as much, well, then you're not getting as much stretch-mediated fatigue, right? So the stretch-mediated fatigue is going to be proportionate to the stretch-mediated stimulus benefit. So I don't necessarily follow that argument of like, well, I wouldn't avoid these just because they're gonna be more fatiguing. One, because I think it's just gonna be proportionate, like the benefit and the pros and the cons are gonna be proportionate in that instance. And I also think that we're probably able to adapt better than most people think to that type of stress to then be able to tolerate that, like throughout a meso. And then if we talk about the Brett one, where he was looking at the glutes, so it's funny because Brett, like, he called to authority all of these people. And I reached out to pretty much everybody. And I don't think there's anybody in the industry that looks at that single sarcomere model and then says, well, that means we should train exercises like that. Like there's nothing in the research to support that would correlate to hypertrophy really well. And the other thing is that, like, he left the total tension off of the chart in that argument, right? And he said that like maximum tension was at the active peak, and it wasn't. Like he goes to 120 degrees, and actually at that 120 degree marker, the total mechanical tension surpassed the active portion. So in that little chart that he showed, it actually shows that the stretch position would be a little bit higher magnitude of mechanical tension than his active, and he cut it off at 120 degrees. And I've made comments on what I think about certain people's research and the way they present things sometimes, and this is one of those reasons why. And I'm like, why cut it off at 120 degrees when I can pull up footage of every single person doing the leg press at our practicals, right? And people are getting 140, 150, even in some cases like 160 degrees of hip flexion, meaning that curve of mechanical tension would have continued to go up, right? And significantly slow, right? So was leaving that total tension curve like off of there by design? Was cutting it off at 120 degrees design? Because if you did those two things, it's a lot easier to like kind of like say, hey, look at this like big thing over here, and don't actually pay attention to the numbers or whatnot. And that's that's one of my pet peeves is like if it's kind of like presenting evidence or data in a very, 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 very skewed way that can be a little bit misleading. So I mean, it's already a big leap to take the mechanics of a single sarcomere and then try and apply that to whole muscle and exercise selection, let alone when you purposely restrict the range of motion and don't look at the total tension within that single sarcomere or cover all the nuances of what would go on there. So essentially what I'm getting at is I have not found anybody else that believes that looking at it that view is like a valid way of saying, well, these exercises are going to be better. My stance is still train both. I think there's value in both of those things, but I don't think that the glutes are going to somehow be a muscle that is different than every other muscle in the body that gets more hypertrophy stimulus in its short position than its lengthened position, right? I just don't buy that at all, and I don't think anybody else does either.
I mean, dude, you invented an exercise that's actually more short biased than the one that he created. So, like, you clearly don't have a problem with training at the
No.
short position. You just have, like, a more maybe politically moderate view of the whole thing.
Yeah, and I honestly, like I say, like, hey, like this exercise, this like top, isolation of the bridge or whatever we're just working, like I'm like, people love that exercise because of all the things that come with metabolic training, right? They can feel it well, it gets them a good pump, they can do a lot of it or whatever, like, and people, they just love, like, they just squeeze their butt, so like a certain demographic just absolutely loves that. But time and time again, I'm like, look, this is the icing on the cake, or the cherry on top. Like, this is not going to be the main driver of your glute growth. I think one thing that can be confusing to a lot of people is because those exercises give you like this perpetual pump, right, that lasts, is they can think like, while I'm using those exercises, I'm getting more hypertrophy just because on average that tissue is staying a little fuller, right? And so like, okay, when they stop doing that, like, okay, well, maybe the hydration in that tissue drops like, a little bit. And they're like, oh no, like I stopped doing this and now I'm no longer growing. And I'm like, well, no, it's just a slightly different adaptation, right? Especially if you combine that with like, oh, well, if I'm training glutes 5 times a week and I'm doing these exercises that like increase hydration to the muscle, right? Well, I'm just constantly pumping my glutes, right? It's like the equivalent of like, doing push-ups and curls before you go out on a date, right? That might make your sleeves a little tighter, for the night out, but I mean, that's not going to actually contribute to growth over time, right? So, when we're looking at these exercises, I think it's important to be like, hey, this is a tool. It can be used in this way, but I don't think you should be tied to like, this tool is better than all other tools, because this is my idea or whatever, right? And I don't even want to say that I invented that, the cast glute bridge or whatever, right? Like, I taught it that way, my entire life, because I saw that's where there was value in this over a traditional hip thrust type movement, right? So yeah, like you said, if Brett's argument is just like, well, it's like, well, why didn't he just start doing it the way I do it, like, 10 years ago instead of, instead of being so attached to the thrust? I don't understand.
Yeah. Straker.
The one thing that I kind of thought that could be kind of relevant here. So when you were describing the model that was kind of capped at 120 degrees, I believe you said it was it a leg press that the model was based off of, or was it not?
It wasn't based off of an exercise. It was literally it's based off a skeletal model that basically it's like you're asking the software to look at what the lengths would be, and it's just an estimate.
Understood. Okay, so with that, would you say, based on, and I'm not trying to like load this in any way or anything like that, that for a majority of, let's say, like biarticular, right, muscles that we can train at the largest range of motion that you can safely attain, and that's going to obviously vary person to person, that mechanical tension, because of some of the things that you've been saying with the titin, and I want to say non-active motor, right? We can create a higher amount of mechanical tension earlier with the largest ranges of motion. Or sorry, in the short end, the deepest into the short or lengthened position.
Yeah, our potential for the non-motor tension is higher than what our cross bridges are, like when we look at it, right? That's why, when you look at these length tension models and you see like the total tension curve, you'll always see the one that's including the passive tension come up and surpass the like active tension portion of that, right? Is the potential is just greater. And with us understanding that filament is active, it lets us understand that like, okay, well, that is actually being a part of the the tension component even earlier in the stretch shortening cycle than what we would have thought if we model it off of just pure passive tension.
Cool. I have one more question. Hopefully it should be short. But there's a lot of questions recently floating around about exercise sequencing, and a lot of people questioning me putting a lot of short overload movements prior to my lengthened version, like leg extensions before pendulum, or cable costal press before like a dumbbell chest variation or something along those lines. In a hypertrophy phase, because I think it would probably change in a metabolic phase, or maybe there wouldn't even be a lengthened component as much in the metabolic phase. But for like a hypertrophy or mechanical tension stage of training, why would we want to put the short overload movement first, and we can, for the moment, take complexity considerations out of it?
Well, if we're looking at the total amount of mechanical tension that you're stimulating over the course of like the whole session, right? If we do the short position first, so the short position exercise is going to be less fatiguing, right, in terms of the nervous system. So that means that your force production is not going to drop off throughout the workout as fast if you do the short position first and then you do the lengthen. So the idea is that while including the short position first and then the lengthen, the total mechanical tension stimulus across the session would be a little bit higher, because the thing that really would drop your force production fatigue, you're doing more towards the end, right? Now, there probably is a point of diminishing returns if you're doing too much volume of the short stuff before the lengthened stuff, right? Because you basically want to maintain a certain level of performance going into that exercise that has a higher one-to-one mechanical tension, perspective, right? But these things probably work themselves out on volume tolerance, meaning that if you did a little bit too much in the short position, what's going to happen is that you're going to fatigue a little earlier in your lengthened position exercise, and you're not going to be able to do as many sets or whatnot, right? And so you could kind of use that as your guide, is that like, all right, if you're doing your short position stuff and you're seeing a dramatic drop in your performance in your lengthened exercise, or you're saying that your tolerance to volume in that exercise is dropping, then maybe the solution is to, cut a set off of the short position or lower your RIR or something so that you have a little bit more there if that's your priority, right? And then the inverse would be true for like a metabolic phase, right? Now, if you flip those things, right, you do the lengthened stuff first and then you did the shortened stuff afterwards, right? You would obviously have the greatest performance in your lengthened exercise that way. But would the performance drop in your short stuff then be like so severe that the net total for the whole thing, was less, right? And so typically I do the same order as you do. I do my short stuff first and then I do my lengthened stuff. But that comes in the caveat that if I'm really focused on those length and bias movements, I'm not pushing to a ton of fatigue or a ton of volume in those short position movements. And if I want to include more of them, that's where I kind of do like the sandwich method, where it's like, all right, I'll do a little bit of short, at the beginning, and then I'll do my lengthened stuff while I still have very little fatigue and get good performance. And then I tack in a little more short on the end for the extra volume, knowing that it won't be fatiguing, but also accepting that there's going to be some performance loss, but it's not in my priority movement. Right.
And you can push harder on the short stuff the second time.
Yeah.
Through.
So then you can bury that stuff and into failure or whatnot. Right. So for instance, like if I'm doing leg extension and hack squat, if I'm going to push the leg extension, like to failure, it's going to come after the hack squat, right? Because I look at that as like, I'm actually, I'm putting a decent amount of fatigue into that. So I don't think people need to be too uptight about these rules. I think what they should do is just look at what is the priority thing that I want to do and what makes sense to get the most performance out of that, right? If it happens to be a situation where you can do some short stuff and basically maintain, relatively the same performance, awesome. If you find that doesn't work that way, then I would be like, well, then just do the short stuff at the end. If you get a little bit, if you lose a few reps on the short stuff, it wasn't the priority for what you were trying to accomplish that, right? So you can have basically lower quality volume that you can just add up as needed at the end if you got your highest quality volume already done and taken care of. So I don't think people should be too obsessed with trying to create a rule around this as much as looking at like an exercise basis, right? So for instance, you said we're going to leave complexity out of it, but that is a factor, right? Like if you're going to do a squat, it's a lot easier to do a squat fresh than having some pre-fatigue in there, right? But some person might say, hey, if I do 2 sets of leg extensions, my squat just then feels so much better, and I can, my mind muscle connection with my quads and whatever. And I'm like, cool, that's fine too, right? But if you do 6 sets of leg extension, and then you come in and now your squat mechanics are all fucked, and it's limiting your output or whatever, then that's a totally different story, right?
Yeah, I said leave complexity out of it because I was going to ask about complexity next, but I think you kind of answered that. I was more thinking about it takes an advanced trainee to execute an RDL properly and safely, and even more so to do it under the conditions of, hey, I already fried my legs on leg curls prior, or hip extensions, or something along those lines. So I definitely think that complexity is for sure a consideration, as it would be in like a free weight back squat. But I just wanted more like kind of that grand overview of the mechanisms behind it. So I think that was
again, I
perfect.
still don't think it should be a rule, because I mean, as coaches, sometimes you're choosing an exercise order for load management, right? So it might be like, look, I want somebody to do RDLs, but I want to decrease the loading that they're using to deload the back. So then if I do leg curls first, they can do RDLs. And even though, I mean, maybe it's a little bit more of a technical challenge. Maybe it's not. Maybe their mind muscle connection and their control is a little bit better, depending on how much I do. But now maybe they need
And the weight's lighter,
25% less weight on their spine, and we're still adding volume to the hamstrings and the glutes, by being able to do those. So, like when it comes to this, man, coaching is all about trying to come up with the solutions for the individual. And if you're coaching yourself, that's the same thing, right? Is have priorities, have goals, and then try and move the pieces around that basically allow you to accomplish those goals as efficiently as possible. Because a lot of times when you're splitting these physiological hairs, they're so context dependent that as soon as you change an exercise or change a little bit of volume or whatever, that like, all right, things are now fluctuating, so you just want to be like, hey, if I can make sure that I dial in the priority, then I'm being as efficient as I possibly can in the most important thing. And, and if I lose a few percentage points on the other things there, it's likely not going to make that much of a difference, right? And as you advance, like these things become a lot more intuitive. Like I'm sure you guys have done programs where like from the first to the last exercise, it just like kind of flowed. Like you just felt like you hit everything at the right time and performed it well. And then I'm sure you've also written programs where it's like, okay, I did this other thing, and then when I went to the second exercise or whatever, it's like it just felt like absolute shit. Like I had nothing to give it or whatever, right? And usually when that happens, it's like, okay, there's probably a better way to distribute either these exercises or the volume or whatnot, or maybe that's just not a good, it's not good exercise, good complementary exercise selection or whatever. And it's like, okay, cool. Then you can work those pieces out, right? I mean, so your personal performance based around your priority should be probably the main goal that you focus on when it comes down to these nuances where it's like, it could go either way.
That's awesome, dude. That's all I got for you, man. You
Problem solvers. Yeah. That's what I look at coaches for.
Aaron, you want to jump in with anything?
No, I mean, I say no and then I start talking. Really, you hit the nail on the head there. For me, like the biggest challenge for me of my training career has always been my quads, and just like they just lag behind everything except for maybe my calves, but like fuck all I'm really doing there. I always had to stack leg extensions in shortened positions before any kind of hack squat, leg press, or whatever, just so that I could get a good stimulus in them. And only in the last like 4, 5, maybe 6 months have I actually been able to like create a very solid connection with my quads now on like hack squat, pendulum sort of thing. And now it goes first because I'm able to like perform that movement much better for the quads. I want to be freshest so that I can get the most lengthened, position out of them. And then my leg extensions are like, okay, I just mashed myself to damn near failure on hack squats. I'm going to go get my additional shortened overload volume on the leg extension, but that's like cherry on top stuff. But for a long time, I needed that first, but now I'm like proficient at performing this, so I can put it in that secondary position. So it may, over your training career or whatever, flow in and out of positions as well.
Yeah. There's so many variables, right? Even just like the exercise selection that you have available, right? So I have the prime leg extension, which allows me to really bias the short position. So if I do hacks and then I do that, because the resistance profile is so different, my performance in those leg extensions tends not to drop off that much, right? In fact, I just did 400 pounds on that selectorized leg extension after hacks for like the
Was that
first
short?
like the first time, right? It's the
Was
first
it
time
short
where
overload today? Yeah.
yeah. So I put it on the 4, right? So it's basically it's the peak of the resistance is just before lockout, if you will, right? On that, yep. Yeah, but that was after all of my sets of hack, right? And I was able to do that. But if I had a leg extension that I wasn't able to bias that profile, that it would have been a lot harder to maintain that performance in that second exercise. So for me, I may have more flexibility with how I use those two things than somebody that just has, either they can't, control the resistance profile of their hack squat or their leg extension, right? So then it's like, well, I have to do them in this order, or I just have a significantly greater performance loss.
Awesome, dude. That's all I got, man. You got anything else to add on the conversation?
No, I mean, summary, guys, is like, look, the main principles will always be there, right? Do enough volume, add enough effort, right? And a lot of this stuff will work it out because you'll realize that you can tolerate more volume with certain exercises than others, and that's likely accommodating for some of the physiological stuff, right? But I think these lengthened bias stuff, if we're looking at efficiency, is a more efficient way of driving hypertrophy. But if the only option you have is a short position exercise, you don't have to cry and think that you're not going to make, any gains, right? As long as you have the other principles in place, right?
And use all the tools because different seasons of
Yeah.
life, different phases of training require different tools to be used.
Fantastic. So to wrap
right.
this one up, Cass, can you plug yourself where the listeners can find more from you, all of the N1 stuff, and I will obviously put all of that in the show notes as well.
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram. It's just coach_Kassem. And then our education is this N1.education, N1.training. We're also on YouTube as N1 Education. And then if you really, really are interested in this stuff, like both of these guys can attest to this, we're in Colorado. We have an HQ where we do all of our research and we teach this stuff hands-on. And I really don't think there's a better way to learn about this stuff than like being able to physically see it and go through it and whatnot. And all the research in the world won't affect you as much as like actual hands-on experience with this stuff. So we'd love to see you there if you guys want to make the trip.
I will.
Yep, I attest. It was
Yeah,
awesome.
I mean, I already want to come back, and it's like I don't know the next time I'll be in the States for a considerable amount of time to line up with one, but I'm still like working through the biomechanics course. It's just so much content. I watch it every day on the treadmill as I'm like at the gym, like warming up and cooling down. But one thing that's cool is like now, because when I was there, it was a lot of like drinking from a fire hose. But now I'm like hearing it for like the third, fourth time, and I'm like, I understand it now. Whereas before I was just like, fuck, is everyone as confused as I am, sort of thing. So it is one of those things that I'm like, I just continue to appreciate it more. I'm having like amazing training sessions now, just the way that I can look at things. I made a post the other day when I was on that trip. I worked out in like a very limited hotel gym, and I was able to put together a fantastic workout because of the things that I learned at the practical with like, okay, well, I'm going to superset this like shortened overload bicep with a lengthened overload, and just like being able to pair things and having that understanding just allows me to be so much more effective with like my own training and then what I help with my clients and stuff. It's just knowledge is power. And one thing that I feel very confident saying is like is like your generation or population of like your lifting population, the amount of knowledge of the actual muscle groups and stuff that we are training, I would say across the board, I generally do not like to speak in absolutes, is still quite poor, which is kind of wild. And it's been something, it's 15, 16 years before I actually started learning around like the mechanics of training and these sorts of things. And I've learned more in the last 18 months than I did in 12 years of training prior in N1. And Cass, you've been massive in as part of that, and Brian too as well. So cool.
Well, thanks again, dude. Appreciate it.
All right, guys. Brian and I will talk to you next week.